Hello and welcome to the Sidebar, presented by True Crime News, taking you inside the courtrooms of high-profile and notorious cases from across the country. I'm your host, Joshua Ritter. I'm a criminal defense lawyer based in Los Angeles and previously an LA County prosecutor for a decade. You can find me on all social media at Joshua Ritter ESQ or at joshuaritter.com. In this week's episode, we're going to take a look back on some of the biggest trials of the year. We have entertainment industry scandals, conspiracy-riddled spectacles, and long-time true crime whodunits that finally reached their conclusion. So let's jump right in. First of all, out of Santa Fe, New Mexico, in a case that shocked the entertainment industry, the fatal on-set shooting of a cinematographer, Halyna Hutchins, reached its conclusion. The deadly incident, which dates back to 2021, occurred during production of Alec Baldwin's film Rust and saw multiple crew members charged along with the actor himself. While the prosecution against Baldwin was fraught from the start, with charges initially dropped before recharging, jurors ultimately found the film's armorer, Hannah Gutierrez-Reed, guilty of involuntary manslaughter for her gross negligence in the handling of the on-set weapon, leading to the death of Hutchins. Meanwhile, prosecutors were forced to again dismiss charges against Baldwin, this time with prejudice, after a Brady violation in which prosecutors failed to disclose information about the live bullets in the prop gun. Though the tragic death appears to have been completely avoidable, the fallout from the incident brought renewed attention to safety on film sets that will likely lead to major changes. However, the loss of life is still completely unacceptable. This case really gave me problems from the very beginning. And it wasn't the idea that law enforcement was looking into it. It wasn't the idea that even prosecutors were going to bring charges. But it was the way in which they handled this that just seemed unprofessional, unseemly. You remember that when they first brought charges, first of all, after nearly a year of an investigation, they made an announcement that they were going to make an announcement. And from the jump, it seemed like they were very concerned with media attention and the publicity that this case would get for this very small county in New Mexico. And ever since that point, they did a media tour, by the way. Ever since that point, it seems like it was misstep after misstep, and I think driven by ego or status or attention. I don't know what you want to call it, but certainly things that a prosecutor shouldn't be concerned with. If you remember, from the very beginning, there was a problem with the way they charged it. One of the charges, the allegations against Baldwin, was something that wasn't even on the books at the time that this incident took place. Then they had to dismiss it. Then they changed prosecutors. Then they got a special prosecutor to come in. They convened a grand jury. Then they brought charges again. And all along the while, we're wondering, should they even be pursuing this case at all? And the way that it ended up, I think, fully validated everyone who did question that. Because the way that it ended up, if we want to start from the end, is that they found that there was a Brady violation, meaning there was a violation of the prosecutor's duty to turn over evidence. Prosecutors are in a unique position because they are the stewards of all of the evidence. It is not up to them to decide what the defense should have or shouldn't, or what should or should not be important to the defense. It is up to them to just make sure the defense gets it. And if a judge decides it's irrelevant or a judge decides that that's not coming in at trial, then leave it up to the judge. But the prosecutor should not be taking it upon themselves to decide what to turn over and what they did not. In this case, they did. In this case, they saw evidence. It was evidence of bullets that were turned over that may have been similar to the bullets that were recovered on the set of Rust. I'm not even going to get into all the particulars of it, but they made a call. They made a judgment call. They said, we don't think this is relevant. Not only did they not inform the defense of that, but they filed that evidence under a different case number. And that is, I'm going to be very diplomatic and use the word problematic, but it's far worse than that. It could have been even something that could have put these prosecutors' bar cards at risk, quite frankly. And that's why the judge in that case was so offended by it. And that's why the judge took as drastic a measure as she did in Baldwin's case. It is not common for judges to find a violation, a discovery violation, and dismiss the entire case. Usually that is remedied in some sort of way by giving the defense more time or making sure that that evidence in dispute does not come in. In this case, she said, "This is such a bad foul up, I'm dismissing the case with prejudice." But it goes back to my original question of why were they pursuing charges against Baldwin in the first place? Hannah Gutierrez-Reed, I understand. She is the armorer. She is the person in charge of maintaining the safety with weapons on set, including the ammunition used in those weapons. She failed miserably. And if you want to say that she should be civilly liable, absolutely. Criminally liable, perhaps, and a jury agreed with that idea. But what are you doing going after the big name actor? Are you pursuing ego and attention and status? Or are you doing the right thing? And maybe I asked that question backwards, but I think the right thing would be to pursue justice and make a decision, even if that decision didn't get you all the media attention that you hoped for. Baldwin was an actor. He's been an actor for decades. He's been handed weapons on set for decades, perhaps hundreds, maybe more. Individual times has he been handed a weapon and been asked to perform a scene with that weapon, because that weapon is a prop. And there is nothing that indicated that should be any different in this instance. Now, you can make arguments all day long about whether or not he had a responsibility to double check the weapon himself, whether or not he ever should have pointed that weapon at anyone. I'm going to say, I'm sorry, but things are different on a movie set. This isn't somebody handling a weapon at a gun range or out hunting. This is somebody being handed a weapon that the purpose of giving them that weapon is to be used as a prop in a movie scene and to act with it. And that includes pointing it at other people. Baldwin got himself into a little bit of trouble and hot water when he overextended his defense and said he never pulled the trigger, and that became quite an issue. But I think end of the day, how are we going to hold an actor criminally responsible for being handed a weapon, a prop? I know it's a weapon and I know it was functioning, but as far as he's concerned, when he's being handed that weapon, it's a prop, and expect him to know that something this tragic and awful could take place. End of the day, the jurors never got to decide that decision because the judge took it out of their hands because of the missteps by the prosecution. But I think that justice was served in the proper way in this case. Let's move on to another case with a lot of controversy surrounding it out of Dedham, Massachusetts, where perhaps no case this year created more division or drew more conspiracy theories than the prosecution of Karen Reed for the death of her boyfriend, former Boston police officer John O'Keefe. It was alleged that Reed struck O'Keefe with her vehicle while under the influence before leaving the man to die in the snow. Reed's defense, however, contended that the entire case was a massive police cover-up, arguing that the man may have died in the home of another officer before his body was dragged outside. Particularly damaging to prosecutors' case was testimony from a state trooper in the investigation who made inflammatory statements about Reed, including derogatory sexual remarks. Ultimately, Reed's defense raised enough reasonable doubt to hang the jury, but it's not the end of the road for Reed, who will face trial again next year, and once again, we will be watching. Let's start from how this case ended to first analyze it. Remember the controversy surrounding this. The jurors came back with notes to the judge, which I think, in my experience, were some of the most clear indications that they were deadlocked that I've ever seen out of jurors. Usually jurors send back a note and something like, we don't know what to do. We feel like we can't agree. What happens if we all can't agree? These jurors sent back a note saying, we've thought about this. We've put in the work. We've considered all the evidence. We are at an impasse. We are deadlocked. There's nothing you can do. And the judge sent him back even after the first note. They come back again. They say they're hopelessly deadlocked. The judge declares a mistrial. And soon after that, according to the defense, a juror started to come forward and say, oh, well, we were deadlocked, but only as to count 2. We were not deadlocked on the more serious charge. On that, we believed that she was innocent or not guilty. And in fact, we didn't even have a problem with the last charge. We felt she was not guilty on that. It was only this second lesser included middle charge that we were really hung on. But they never indicated any of that to the judge. That has all been litigated. That has all been handled. She's going to be retried on everything because a mistrial was declared. But why is all of that circus that took place afterwards important? Because a lot can be learned from how that ended. Lessons can be learned for both the prosecution and the defense in this case. First of all, prosecutors, I think, need to take a serious look at this case and realize what they can and cannot prove here. I think that they have made a mistake by pursuing the most serious charge against Karen Reed again. I think the jurors indicated, if they can believe those affidavits and the statements made by jurors, and I don't think there's any reason to say they shouldn't be believed, but they didn't buy that she did this on purpose, that there was intent behind it. Prosecutors should learn from that. They haven't. They're going to retry her on that again. Where they have learned is that they've pivoted in their strategy. There's a new prosecutor, and he is absolutely a new sheriff in town. And one of the things he's doing is going after Reed's statements far more aggressively and taking the defense arguments far more aggressively. There's a lot of litigation going on right now about whether or not the so-called dog bite expert of the defense can testify in the second trial, and whether or not the prosecution will get in interviews that Karen Reed made with media outlets beforehand, where she may have made inculpatory statements. But the defense can also learn from what ended, how that case ended, because what the jurors indicated is, though they may have acquitted or found there was not enough evidence to support the more serious charge against Karen Reed, they didn't dismiss her involvement in this completely. To me, that indicates that they didn't really buy the defense conspiracy theory. The idea that this man, she had nothing to do with it, and that this man was killed inside of the basement of a home and dragged outside. They felt she was involved. It just came down to a matter of intent. Will the defense change their strategy? I don't know. They haven't indicated anything otherwise. But it might be interesting how this case could end up if they did attack that idea of intent, and that though this may have happened, and though it may have been her vehicle that struck him, she certainly did not intend to do that. Now, knowing the conspiracy that follows this case, I know we're going to get a lot of comments from people saying there's no evidence that he was hit by a vehicle, and there's no evidence that those injuries are consistent. Well, there is broken taillight fragments that were recovered. And there's only two ways to explain that. Either that happened from her vehicle hitting John O'Keefe, or that was planted. And if you believe it was planted, then you believe the whole conspiracy theory. And I'm just saying the jurors on the first go around didn't seem to buy that idea. But we will see how things turn out in the new year. In the meantime, let's turn to Manatee County, Florida, where in another case of a woman charged in the death of her partner, but with a very different outcome. The media dubbed Black Swan trial ended in a conviction for a former ballerina. Ashley Benefield was charged with a fatal shooting of her estranged husband, Doug Benefield, who claimed that the killing was motivated by self-defense after years of abuse at the hands of her former husband. Prosecutors contend that Benefield's real motive was the allure of gaining sole custody of the couple's child at any cost. While jurors couldn't completely sympathize with Benefield's, they found some merit to her narrative, convicting her of the lesser charge of manslaughter rather than second-degree murder. Was this a win for either side? I don't think so. The prosecution didn't get what they wanted, but I think they were asking for too much. I don't think that this was a murder case. I think it was a manslaughter case. The defense didn't get what they wanted, but I think they were also expecting too much. They presented evidence of violence taking place in that home, and they presented this concept of a battered partner syndrome, battered spouse syndrome, whatever you want to call it. And she testified, and I think she needed to. Because in these types of cases, these self-defense cases, these cases that revolve around the idea of domestic violence, jurors need to hear it from the mouth of the accused themselves. And she testified, and I think that she did well. There were some things that she probably could have done better at, but I think overall you can say that she performed. And I don't use perform as to characterize it as a performance, but I think she handled herself reasonably well. But at the end of the day, I don't think that she could adequately explain to the jurors why she had no choice but to take this man's life in that moment. She may have given them a good understanding of the context of violence, and there was evidence of violence. And she may have given them a good understanding of the context of what was in her mind at that moment. But did that really answer the question of she had no choice? There was nothing else reasonably she could have done in that moment but to take this man's life. Remember, battered spouse or battered partner syndrome, it is an explanation for the mindset and the surrounding circumstances of the position of the defendant at the time that the alleged crime takes place, but it is not a blank check for murder. And I think that's what this case teaches us more than anything, is that people may understand, people may appreciate, people may even empathize with what a defendant was going through, but that may not excuse the steps that they took in those crucial moments. Let's move on to Delphi, Indiana, where 2024 also saw the conclusion of a high-profile true crime case that's puzzled online sleuths and law enforcement for years. After endless speculation and rumors fueled by a grainy video with the haunting phrase, quote, "guys down the hill," Richard Allen was convicted for the murders of Abby Williams and Libby German. Nearly 8 years after the girls were tragically murdered on a hiking trail, jurors deliberated for around 20 hours before rendering their verdict. While the fireworks before trial included claims of a pagan cult and potential police cover-up, Allen's own admissions after he was incarcerated seemed to carry the most weight with jurors, who decided conclusively that he was the infamous bridge guy. Allen has yet to be sentenced, but he is looking at 45 to 130 years behind bars, finally bringing closure to the families of the victims whose daughters would have been close to finishing college if their lives weren't so ruthlessly taken. I had real problems with the lack of transparency in this trial. This case was really closely watched across the country, but especially in Indiana, especially in that small community. Delphi is not very big. This was a big case to those people, to that community, and in fact, to the rest of the country for folks like you and I who watch these cases. But the judge decided not only were there going to be no cameras inside the courtroom, but there would be no electronics allowed for any reporters, that the jury would be sequestered. And then I'm not talking about, hey, don't talk to people about the case. I'm talking about you are living away from your family with no communication with the outside world while this case is pending. And there was a gag order put in place. Those are severe and tremendous efforts to make sure that no information about this case was getting to the outside public. And that, I think, created problems that we're going to talk about now. But in the end, this case really came down to, do you believe, and by you, I mean the jurors, do they believe that Richard Allen's own words or not? Really, that was it. Yes, I know there was the grainy video. No one could ID this man out of that video. Yes, there were some eyewitnesses, but no one could really positively identify Richard Allen. There was the gun mark evidence. It was a little groundbreaking and a little pushing the envelope in what we've seen in the past. But really, you can put all of that to the side, because end of the day, it came down to, did they believe Allen when he, one, placed himself at the scene before his arrest, and even more importantly, the 60 plus confessions that he made after his arrest. Now, the defense did an admirable job of presenting evidence of the condition that he was being housed in, his deteriorating mental state, and whether or not that could have caused false confessions. And that's why the lack of transparency in this case is so bad, because we don't know how this all played out in court. And because we don't know how this all played out in court, I think this became one of those cases where so much conspiracy followed it. Many people who follow this show were upset by the results of that case, were upset by the conviction of Richard Allen. All of us are good-hearted people, and I think all of us want to see justice for Abby and Libby. Some people felt that this wasn't justice, and that is because we don't know at the end of the day how this all played out in court, because we were getting, and as Herculean as a job as what some of the reporters were doing inside of that courtroom, people taking notes by hand, trying to transcribe nearly everything that took place. Nothing can replace having cameras inside of the courtroom, having the transcripts available to us, having reporters who can sit there and at least type things in real time. And instead, we're left with many questions, and it put a lot of people in a position where they had trouble with how this case ended up. And that, to me, is something that could have been avoided. One of the things that makes our American system of criminal justice so unique and wonderful is this idea that the public is invited inside of the courtroom, and you can see how justice is made. But when you put such severe restrictions on that, as was done in this case, for really no good explanation, you're going to have problems. You're going to have people who are questioning whether or not the right thing was done. And at the end of the day, that to me is a tragedy as well. Let's move on to the case that capped the end of the year. And that is, in a case that may have the weightiest implications for 2025 and beyond, we have to talk about the arrest of Sean Diddy Combs, who may have seen his last day out of a jail cell. We talked early in this year about the raids on Combs' homes in Los Angeles and Miami with a level of federal police presence. It seemed only a matter of time before something big was announced. Months later, in May, CNN released a video that appeared to depict Combs assaulting his longtime partner, Cassie Ventura, but still no criminal charges were filed, paving the way for a massive announcement. In September, authorities arrested Combs on charges of racketeering, sex trafficking by force, and transportation for prostitution, denying the media mogul bond in the process. While Combs' sex parties, known as freak-offs, were known as clandestine meetups for the rich and famous, some thought those secrets would never come to light. However, just recently, we've seen rapper Sean Carter, better known as Jay-Z, named in a lawsuit alleging sexual assault at the hands of Carter and Combs. Who will be named next remains to be seen, but at the time of this recording, Diddy faces over 100 different lawsuits alleging sexual misconduct, and the floodgates don't appear to be closing. Let's talk a little bit first about how strong of a case is this against Diddy. Well, it's the federal government. That's about as strong as it gets. The federal government doesn't file anything unless they feel that that case is completely locked up. I worked as a prosecutor for the state, for the county of Los Angeles. Very different than a U.S. attorney. For a long time, I was a prosecutor. And we had cases that were sometimes problematic. And it was the Wild West in many cases, because you just had to handle what came through. Now, every case that we filed, we felt like was a righteous filing, and we felt like we could prove it. But many cases that we took to trial would be cases that the federal government would have dismissed and never pursued, because they don't pursue anything unless it is locked up 7 different ways. So when it's the U.S. versus Diddy, you can be sure that's a very strong case. And what we know about it sounds very strong too. The evidence that is coming out sounds very strong. And I'll say this as well. This case is a conspiracy case. It talks about the criminal enterprise, the business enterprise of Diddy. Yet it's the U.S. versus one man, Sean Combs. That means that everybody else involved in that conspiracy, you can be sure the federal government has talked to, and they've made them this very simple offer. Would you like to help us, or would you like to be on the other side of that versus in U.S. versus? And right now, because it just remains U.S. versus Sean Combs, it looks like most of those folks have all made the decision to go ahead and cooperate. So as strong as that case may have been beforehand, you can bet it's getting even stronger with each passing day. But the question that a lot of people are asking is, should we expect more celebrities to be implicated? In my view, the world, certainly the entertainment world, changed when Diddy got arrested. No one is safe anymore. If you're a celebrity, a person in power, you thought you were untouchable, you thought you could operate with impunity, that is not true. This is probably one of the most powerful people in the music industry, with wealth and influence beyond what most of us can even imagine, who acted as a menace, according to all the things we're starting to learn, for decades. And he was untouchable until now. And people are learning their lessons. Other celebrities are watching, and they have scattered from this man. He is toxic at a nuclear level. No one wants to be associated with him. No one is coming to his aid. No one is coming to his defense, because they know if he got taken down, then maybe they could get taken down. But the other thing that's being learned is from all the people who have been victimized, who have been in fear, who have kept their mouths shut, who have been scared to come forward and even talk to law enforcement, are now saying, oh, you guys are going to take this seriously for once. Law enforcement is actually going to do something about these allegations for once. Well, then, yes, I do feel comfortable, and I do want to tell my story, and I do want something done, and I do want justice. To the tune of 100+ people have now filed lawsuits, including the newest breaking news at the end of the year here with these allegations against Jay-Z. Now, I know that right now, as things sit, it is a civil lawsuit, and that is miles away from a criminal indictment. But I'm going to give you a few names here. Harvey Weinstein, R. Kelly, P. Diddy. All of those started out with civil lawsuits. Every single one of those men is now behind bars. Don't for a moment believe that this just being a civil lawsuit is nothing for Jay-Z to worry about. I think it absolutely is. And there is definitely an argument for how this case could be filed criminally, both dealing with the hurdle of the statute of limitations and dealing with the idea of how do they prove it. Because if you read that complaint, they talk about Sean Carter, Jay-Z being involved in the assault. They talk about Sean Combs, P. Diddy being involved in the assault. And they talk about one unnamed, very recognizable female celebrity, just simply described as Celebrity B. If law enforcement is involved, you can bet that their first question was, who is Celebrity B and how do we speak to her? And if my assessment of how people are viewing Diddy is true, then Celebrity B has a choice, like everybody's had a choice. Do you want to cooperate with the government, or do you want to end up on the other side of U.S. versus? And I think that that person is probably reading the tea leaves as much as we are and saying, I don't want any trouble. That's what I mean when I say that the world has changed. No one is willing to help this toxic man out any longer. And people are really looking to preserve themselves. But that is all for the new year. We will see what 2025 will bring. That is our show for this week. We'd like to give a very special thanks to all of our listeners and viewers. We appreciate you making us a part of your life for another year. I am your host, Josh Ritter. You can find me on Instagram and Twitter at Joshua Ritter ESQ. And if you want to hear more of my thoughts and coverage on even more true crime cases, you can also check out my brand new YouTube channel, Courtroom Confidential. And of course, you can find all of our Sidebar episodes wherever you get your podcasts. and we would love to hear from you. If you've got questions or comments you'd like us to address, please tweet us your questions with the hashtag #TCNSidebar. And thank you again for joining us at the True Crime News Sidebar.